Hello and welcome to this revision summary for Paper 2, Topic 1, which is the topic of changing cities. So in this session we're going to be outlining to you the overall topic content, as well as incorporating quite a number actually of exams-based skills which you are going to be able to utilise when it comes to, hopefully anyway, the exams themselves. So the important distinction to start with is that we look at specifically Norwich and Mexico City. Now, most of the material that's provided by the exam board focuses on Birmingham and Mexico City, but as you guys live locally to Norwich, we thought it would be far easier for you to visualise and put into context the content through the case study of Norwich instead. Okay, so Paper 2, Topic 1, here we go. So in summary, it's worth 30 marks, so it doesn't have a 4-mark spag question for the 8-marker at the end. It will have one 8-marker, just like all the topics do, except the first one of Paper 1, and that will be either assess or evaluate as its command word. Please again refer to the 8-markers made easy PowerPoint and the how to write good conclusion videos that I provided in the GCSE revision folder as well. 8-mark questions that you get in this topic are often potentially, but often linked specifically to one of the two case studies, or even potentially both. So expect to have to know specific details about Norwich or Mexico City that you might be able to incorporate within your essay. Most questions are not going to need specific case study details, and largely most of the case study stuff is really just to help your understanding of some of the things that we discuss and some of the concepts you encounter across the topic of changing cities. And in 2019, just to illustrate that, actually 18 of the 30 marks that were awarded didn't have a case study detail required in them at all. And remember, of the 12 that did, 8 of those marks were just from one question. So realistically, you're probably going to have maybe one 4-mark question and the 8-mark question where the case study details are going to be important. However, we're not going to know what those case study details are going to be, so you still need to know everything about them. Sorry. Now, there's, like with every exam, but this one seems to be particularly the case, there's lots of skills likely to be assessed through the examination, and that could include map skills, graph skills, and other numeracy skills as well. So there is a skills and geographical skills revision video as well in the GCSE revision playlist, so please feel free to have a look at that as well. Okay, so now we know Paper 2 Topic 1 in summary, let's get on with the content. So the topic begins by just addressing and outlining what urbanisation is in general. And it's quite an important concept because urbanisation doesn't just get mentioned in changing cities topic discreetly. It actually gets mentioned in the development topic. It gets mentioned when it comes to the UK challenges topic on Paper 3. So urbanisation is really, really important thing to understand. And in its most basic form, there's a definition on the screen. It's the increase in the proportion of people living in towns and cities. So the UK is about 80% urbanised. What that means is that it's got about 80% of people living in towns and cities of its total population. India is around 40% urbanised. So again, that shows you that it's got 40% of people living in towns and cities, and therefore it's not as urbanised. It's got, the majority of its population live in rural areas. So urbanisation globally is rising, and developed countries, urbanisation, I should say, has happened, already pretty much. It's still a proportion of people moving to urban areas, but it's much, much slower growth. You can see from this graph that the urban areas and how they've grown is clearly taking over the rural areas. Now, up until the sort of 2010, 2015 time scale, rural areas were actually growing as well alongside urban areas, even though urban areas were growing much faster. You can see there's a faster increase over of those urban areas, those towns and cities. But 2015 actually marks a specific point in time where more than 50% of the world's population on average lived in towns and cities, and that was the first time that happened. And the developing countries are now moving towards far greater urbanisation than they were. So a bit of a comparison between the two, because you need to know about how urbanisation has occurred in both developed countries and developing and emerging countries. So developed countries, I've already mentioned, they have urbanized already. Largely they urbanized between the 18th and 19th centuries, whereas in developing and emerging countries, they are undergoing their rapid urbanization right now. Now, the reason for that urbanization is actually largely the same, but again, we focus on a different aspect. So, in the developed countries, the urbanization that occurred in the 18th, 19th centuries was because of that agricultural and industrial revolutions. The introduction of basically machines to do the jobs of people. Now, in the rural areas, that meant that one tractor could do the job of hundreds of people. So those hundreds of people needed to find work somewhere else. And when it came to the industrial revolution aspect of that, and mechanisation, it meant that the growth of factories and factory lines, which still used machines and mechanised processes, but needed more people to operate them and monitor them and check them. So the industrial and agricultural revolutions essentially encouraged movement of people away from rural areas into urban areas in the 18th and 19th centuries. In the developing and emerging world, that basically is the reason why there is huge rural to urban migration now. But alongside the jobs that occur there, a lot of it is because of other push and pull factors that help their quality of life. So in the developing world, there's greater uneven development. The cities and towns tend to have better access to education and healthcare services and other facilities and things like that, and better road networks and connectivity with things like internet and water and gas and electricity. So moving to those areas is really something that a lot of people in the rural communities who still have lots of jobs in agriculture want to do, because they can get more reliable work, better pay, and better access to all those things. Developed countries' recent urbanisation, which is kind of more re-urbanisation, we'll talk about that in a second, is much more slow and much more manageable. And that's why you tend to find we don't have in developed countries things like shanty towns developing and huge issues with waste disposal. Not that we don't have our issues, but we're able to manage them slightly better by building affordable housing and places. Developing and emerging countries again have an issue with regards to the rapid growth of those cities, because not only is there lots of rural to urban migration, but there's a high birth rate compared to the death rate, and so you've got what's called natural increase going on. So again, it makes it less manageable, and the issues that are associated with that we'll find out towards the end of this session. And then I've got a comparative stat for you just to show you the rate of urbanisation in these areas. So looking at the UK in 1950, it was already about 80% urbanised. By 2050, so a 100-year period, it's going to be about 85% urbanised. So that's an urbanisation growth rate of 5%. It's still urbanising, but it's far, far slower. 1% every 20 years. China in 1950 was at 10% urbanised, so miles behind the UK. And by 2050, it's going to be about 75% urbanised. So you can see that the rapid urbanisation that's occurred in that 100-year period of 65% additional people moving to towns and cities is very, very different to the UK's rate of growth. And because of that, places like China, places like Mexico City need to try and manage some of the issues associated with that rapid urbanisation. Okay, so impacts of urbanisation in general is a kind of images to help summarise this for you, and I'll give you some text over the top of them too. So you need to be aware of some of the generic impacts of urbanisation, and some of them can be good, and most of them though are generally associated with being negative, and the ones that the exam would portray to you are largely more negative. So the top left hand side you can see is a favela, and a favela is just one example of an informal housing, so shanty houses. Now that's a bad thing, and that's why I put it in red. They're illegal, they're unplanned, and because they are unplanned, they are unsafe. The reason we plan any kind of infrastructure, any housing project, is because we assess, is it worthwhile doing it? Does it have any risks associated with it? If people are just kind of rocking up and building wherever they want without looking at the risks associated with it, then they are at risk. There is a lack of safety there, and the favelas built on steep-sided slopes after lots of rainfall are subject to things like landslides and can lead to hundreds and hundreds of deaths if there's a collapse. So that's one issue. Air, water and noise pollution is something which you find in both developing and developed cities, again to differing levels, but air, water and noise pollution can all increase with urbanisation. There's more people, there's going to be more cars, there's going to be more energy being required, and therefore it's going to lead to a greater increase in these things. Another negative, inequality. When we look at Norwich as well as Mexico City, you will see there is differences between the rich and the poor, the deprived areas of a city and the less deprived areas of a city. Now, in developing countries, that gap is much more stark. So, for example, parts of Mexico City that are more deprived spend 10% of their income on a very small quantity of water. Whereas in the wealthy parts of Mexico City, they spend 10 times less on the water and they use 10 times more. So that's massive inequality with just one resource. And there's also other issues with regards to life expectancy, access to education, crime rates, that sort of thing. When you look at Norwich, it's more... it's shocking in our perspective. When we focus on Norwich, we really look at kind of areas such as Mile Cross, and Mancroft Ward, and we compare them against places like Eton, and we can see just how different, because of deprivation statistics and factors, that things like life expectancy are and opportunities are. So this gap between the rich and the poor and inequality really is present in both. And a benefit of urbanisation is that, particularly with the rapid urbanisation that's going on in the developing world, you can see on that graph, things like wages are going up. People are getting better paid because there is more investment in these towns and cities from countries abroad, companies abroad, foreign direct investment it's called, which links into the development topic. It can improve services, and India is a great example when we look at the development topic of a place which has benefited a lot from foreign direct investment, and as a result has massively increased its economy, and India is going to be the world's second largest economy by 2050. So what you've got there is a good summary. Sorry, I just took a slurp of coffee. A good summary of the generic kind of impacts of urbanisation with a bit of explanation around them. Okay, now a bit of exam skills. I did say that there would be opportunities to practice exam questions, and I've got this in this particular presentation a couple of times, and it's to try and help you remember the kind of middle difficult command words. So I focus loads of time in lessons and on YouTube looking at the examine, assess and evaluate 8-mark questions, as well as a PowerPoint showing the discuss question of paper 3. But I don't really focus a specific video on explain and the difference between explain and state. So I'm going to incorporate that into this particular PowerPoint, and I'll do it a couple of times. So essentially what you've got here is the same question 3 times, which changes based on either the command word or the number of marks awarded. So the one on the left hand side says state, and state is just a one kind of mark answer however you look at it. So state one effect of rapid urbanisation in the developing and emerging world, or in developing and emerging countries. So one effect, state. I've just got to name something that happens. So shantytowns develop, that'd be worth a mark. Increase in air pollution, increase in noise pollution, water pollution, wealth divide worsens or increases, services improve. So it can be positive, okay, a positive effect. But this really is just using the information from the last slide and just naming it. You wouldn't have to write very much to get the mark here. When this command word changes, it's the same question, one effect of rapid urbanisation, okay? This one's for 2 marks, but it says explain. So to get 2 marks, you've got to do twice as much, but you're still only naming one effect. So what you need to do is take one of these effects and then explain it. You've got to tell me why that happens because of rapid urbanisation. So development of shanty towns, first mark, because there's not enough affordable or available houses. Air, water, noise pollution increase because there are more cars or there's more industry. Services improve. Why? Because there's more investment in the cities as they grow from FDI. So that's how you'd get the second mark. And people that, if the explain question comes up, most people, most candidates don't have any trouble getting the first mark, because this is easy to get, really. Bit of common sense, will get you that. But to get the second mark is more tricky, and this will be where it divides up the people getting grades 1, 2 and 3 from those getting grades 4, 5, 6 and upwards. Where you've got even more tricky questions, again, it's the same question, explain one effect, but the thing that's changed here is it's actually worth 3 marks. So you've got to look out for that too. And again, it's the same principle. If we start by looking at the development of shanty towns and then take our explain for 2 marks, we just have to add another developed point on there. So development of shanty towns, 1 mark, because there's not enough available houses, 2nd mark, which means people build their own houses out of scrap on undeveloped land. So it's just taking that explanation a bit further to show the examiner you really know this issue. Okay, another example for you, air noise pollution increase, 1st mark, because there are more cars, 2nd mark, as a result of more people migrating from rural areas for work. So again, it's just adding layers onto that particular explanation of the answer, and just look out for these command words: state, explain, and the marks it's worth, and that will really guide you on there. Okay, I'll give this another example in another part in this session. So then the content moves away from just urbanisation and the impacts of it in general, and comparing the developed and developing worlds, and looks at urbanisation in the UK in general. Like all topics really in this specification, there's always a bit of a UK focus. So looking at the map that you can see of the UK, you can clearly see this shows population density, and the darker the red and the more clustered the red, the more people, effectively. And in the UK, clearly urbanisation varies, because cities and towns are where you've got lots of people per square kilometre. So the places in the darkest red are probably cities. And over here you can actually see Norwich is a little red speck over here. And because Norwich is a city, so it's got a high population of people in a small-ish, comparatively, area. But you can see there are lots of white patches around the UK, which tell you there is lots more spread out people, and these are the areas of countryside. And East Anglia and Norfolk as well, particularly known for its rural, farming, agricultural areas, is a place where the population is a little bit more spread out. So urbanisation and towns and cities are not evenly spread around the UK. So this is another bit of exam practice. At some stage, it might not be in this topic, but in one of your topics, you will probably have to describe the distribution of something. And what that means is you just say how things are spread out, but you use the resource. So things you can do, firstly, when you're talking about how things are spread, a way to get 1 easy mark is to say if it's even or uneven. Then start to use your compass directions, your knowledge about compass points. Do you find more people in the south, the north, the northeast, the southwest? This is a bit more complex and sophisticated description language when it comes to distributions. Is the thing you're looking at, in this case, the number of people, are they dispersed? That means spread out. Are they linear and in a line? Are they clustered together? Use your knowledge of the UK, but anywhere looking at a map, to try and name a specific place or use a number from the key. Now, if you're into mnemonics and to help you remember stuff, if you want to use this one to help you describe the distribution if you struggle, then feel free. I mean, I'm not suggesting you do, but it might help someone out there that really struggles with this. The EU never eat shredded wheat. They do love clusters and special K, and hopefully you can see where those letters have been kind of put into the mnemonic. I'll be honest, I'm not sure this is going to have much uptake from people, but if you struggle to remember these ways of describing distributions, this might help you, okay? So I'll just put it out there anyway. But what does this look like? Well, let's put it into context. If I got a question that said describe the distribution of the UK, or the distribution of people in the UK, this would be a really comprehensive answer, and I've tried to incorporate as many of these things as possible. So firstly, the population of the UK is unevenly spread. Uneven. There is generally more in the south than in the north. Okay, that makes sense. There are large clusters of populations in the southeast and the northwest, where I've named London, Manchester, Liverpool. So again, I've named specific place from the key. With over 1,000 people per square kilometre. So again, I've used a number. So I've done even, uneven. I've done compass directions. I've used clusters. I've named specific places using compass directions, and I've used the key. So there you go. That just shows you how you can use these things to produce a really good answer, which focuses on using the resource well. Okay, so now we need to know why the UK's population varies in terms of where it's found and why urbanisation varies. And there are three images here that describe that in decent kind of detail. Now just have a little look at these to see what you think they show. Okay, so hopefully you identified the first one shows relief. And that's the first thing really that determines, it's a physical factor that determines where people settle. Because if you've got an area of mountains, it's harder to build, it's harder to grow crops, it's harder to build roads. So they are naturally going to be far more spread out and dispersed with regards to urbanisation. You're not really going to build a city on the middle of a mountain. It's very, very difficult to do. The middle diagram, which is a satellite image, shows, it kind of links in with the first one actually, but it shows you areas of Scotland which are basically snowy, and that illustrates climate. So climate is another physical factor which can affect where people settle. So not only in Scotland have you got mountains, but you've also got really cold, rainy or icy weather, which are all going to be a barrier to lots of people living there, because you can't grow lots of food and you can't build housing. And another factor, which is sort of a more kind of industry, economic-based factor, is things like ports. So places that have port cities are places where there's potential job opportunities, chances to get trade, and they can also be places that are more densely populated. This map, by the way, it only shows you some port cities. It doesn't show you places like Felixstowe. Great Yarmouth even is a port town. And you can see that a lot of these places are situated around large population centres. So relief, climate and ports are really the main factors that affect the UK's, originally anyway, its distribution of towns and cities and urbanisation. Now associated with that, I'd like to apply the same principle that we've just done. So what I want you to do this time, now you've seen it done once, is try and answer those three questions in the way that I've demonstrated in the previous kind of part of this video. So pause the screen, have a go at all three of them, and then I'll go through the answers for you. Okay, so the first one, the distinction here is that it says state two factors that cause differences in the rate of urbanisation. So this is where you literally just name two different things. You'd need to get two of these to get 2 marks. So relief or mountains have fewer people. Colder climates have fewer people. Port cities have more people. Any one of those things you mentioned would get a mark, so you need up to 2 of those. Now, if you had to explain 2 factors for 4 marks, then you would take one of them and develop it. So mountains mean fewer people because it's harder to build and develop. That's 2-mark answer. To get your second 2-mark answer, you need to do another factor. So colder climates have fewer people, 1 mark, because it's harder to grow crops, 2 marks. Or port cities have more people, 1 mark, because there are more job opportunities, 2nd mark. The third one, again, you see the distinction between the types of marks. This actually wants you to explain 1 factor. So you've got to take one of these and try and develop it a couple of times, okay, to get 3 marks. So mountainous areas mean fewer people, 1 mark, because it's harder to build and develop. The settlement, 2nd mark, which means growth is slower and people will build in flatter areas. Or port cities have more job opportunities because it attracts people to move away from other areas with fewer jobs. Okay, so that hopefully your answers are along those lines, or you can recognise where the extra marks have been awarded. Okay, moving on. So now we start to get down to the nitty-gritty of our case studies, and I'm just going to take one more swig of coffee before I then do the bit of a mammoth session. Sorry if that sounds gross, by the way, through your speakers. I apologise. So we focus on Norwich and Mexico City, the exam board will require you to know both of your case studies essentially as much detail about them as you possibly can. Now, the things that are going to be covered over the next slides, okay? Site, situation, connectivity, functions of both Norwich and Mexico City. You need to know this information for both. You need to know the structure of the cities for both. You need to know the changes because of urbanization and the impacts of urbanization in both. You need to know how migration affects both national and international migration. So how it affects the population and how it affects other aspects of living in the towns and cities. You need to look at inequality and the quality of life for both. You need to look at de-industrialization and the impacts that has on the economy and on jobs for just Norwich. Because Mexico City is industrializing currently, it hasn't really gone through de-industrialization, so this doesn't apply to Mexico City. So any questions in an exam that talk about de-industrialization, you really just need to focus on the knowledge from Norwich. Also, with regards to Norwich, we focus on how the CBD has been changed over the course of responding to these waves of deindustrialisation. So, how retail in Norwich, for example, has changed, and what the Norwich's CBD have done to fight back against sort of deindustrialisation. Improving sustainability, we focus on Norwich for that explicitly, but in Mexico City, or for Mexico City, we still talk about sustainability, but it's more about how we can resolve the issues about rapid growth. So rapid urbanization, which isn't happening in Norwich but is in Mexico City, is only really something you apply to Mexico City. So what are they doing to solve the problems of rapid urbanization in Mexico City? And you'll encounter both top-down and bottom-up strategies to try and do that. Now you'll notice there's a big yellow box, and yellow boxes often in my PowerPoints tend to suggest that this is quite important. So it's only really going to be in 2 questions probably in this topic where you need to know information about your 2 cities. But because we don't know which aspect of Mexico or Norwich they could ask you about, you still need to know all of those aspects. Okay, so expect it for the 8-mark question for sure, and also expect at least one extended answer, sort of 3 or 4-mark question as well, that might ask you to use another one, because they'll want to ask you about both Norwich and Mexico City, or assess your knowledge of developed cities and less developed cities as well. So you need to know it, and there's no getting around it. It's just hard graft, I'm afraid. So we're going to start with Norwich, okay? And with regards to Norwich, I'm going to present to you some of the definitions of the key terms, which I'm not going to repeat when we get to Mexico City. So you get Norwich, it might take a little bit longer to get through. So site, situation and connectivity, they're the first 3 things that we encountered in that first bullet point. So for Norwich, and Mexico City, what we mean by site, a definition of site, is the physical sort of characteristics of the actual place you built your settlement. So for Norwich, it was a low crossing point on either side of the River Wensum. It was fairly near the North Sea, and actually the estuary was closer to Norwich when it first settled. It's built on flat land, which is rich in fertile alluvium or soil, so you could grow lots of crops. And underneath the city is a bedrock of chalk, which has got a couple of uses. Firstly, flint is found within chalk, which is a good building stone. You see it for lots of the historic buildings of Norwich. The medieval churches, for example, are built of flint. And also the chalk itself holds moisture. It can be used to store water underground as a reliable and safe source. So you can pump it out through an aquifer. Through a pump out of the rock, which is effectively called an aquifer. Situation. Norwich situation is where Norwich is in relation to the other features that surround it. Now those could be other cities or towns, but they could also be natural features like rivers or seas, for example. So Norwich is found on the River Wensum near the confluence of that and the Yare, and the River Yare runs out to Great Yarmouth, which gives Norwich very little distance to get to the North Sea and the port of Great Yarmouth, which is very important. It meant they could trade with the Netherlands and the rest of Europe. But also Norwich historically was close to Thetford, which used to be an important place. I'm not saying it's not now, but not as important as it used to be. But certainly it's still certainly within a reasonable time, 2 hours, hour and a half of London and Cambridge, with 2 very significant cities in England. And connectivity. Connectivity is a place's ability, so in this case Norwich's ability, to reach and interact with other parts of the world. Now that might be because of physical road networks, rail networks. It could also be to do with internet, and even in Norwich, the internet, which is associated with being quite poor because of Norfolk, Norwich's internet is fine. It's pretty good. You can still do everything you need to do and connect with the world from Norwich. But in terms of physical connections, we've got our A11, which has been recently dualled in some parts as well to help improve the speed of getting into London. Norwich to London, Liverpool Street takes about 2 hours on the train. But also, we've got an international airport. Norwich Airport will link to lots of parts of the UK, but also it'll take you to Schiphol Airport in Amsterdam, which will almost take you anywhere in the world. So we have fairly good links anyway for a remote rural area. Now, functions of a settlement are another thing you need to be aware of, and a function relates to a city's main activities or a settlement's main activities. And any settlement really has lots of functions, particularly the bigger ones. Now they could be whether it's a mining town or city, not so much Norwich. A tourist resort doesn't have to be seaside. Norwich is a place that attracts a large number of tourists. A place where people live, that's what we mean by residential. A place where you've got admin, so town centre, town council, city council, county council. Commercial buildings, so shops, retail, businesses. A place where it's a route centre, so it's got a rail station, a bus station. Manufacturing. Norwich does have manufacturing, not as much as it used to, and we'll find a bit more about that in a bit, but it's certainly somewhere that had manufacturing in the past, just not now, really. It's not a port city, but lots of places are, like Great Yarmouth nearby. Cultural and religious, absolutely. Norwich has got a rich history. It's a market town. The largest permanent outdoor market in Europe, or certainly used to be, might not be now, but it definitely was up to about 5 years ago at least. So these are all different functions that relate to settlements. Now Norwich has got examples of all of these. You can see here there's County Hall, so it's an admin centre. These three buildings, you've got the castle and the cathedrals. They represent obviously cultural and historical significance. People live in Norwich, particularly the inner city and the suburbs. It's not a large city, but it's got a lot of people that live there. It's got commercial buildings. Aviva, a international company. They've got branches across the world. They're linked with Spain a lot. And it's a market town and also a route centre. And you can see just here I've illustrated the northern bypass, the NDR, but you've also got the southern bypass, the A47 that goes around Norwich, and the train station, bus station, etc. So Norwich has got many, many functions. Now the next thing, and I'm going to leave this on the screen for you to make sure your notes have got these in, and if you haven't got these notes, you need to make sure you do have, so you can either screenshot it or you can jot it down. But I'm not going to spend hours talking through every single part of this. In summary, this table shows you the structure of Norwich, and again, if you go back part of the PowerPoint or part of this video I showed you, you need to know about the structure of both Norwich and Mexico City. So cities are structured in sort of regions. We tend to call the middle part of the city the CBD, Central Business District. Then the inner city areas, followed by the suburbs and the rural urban fringe. Now this you might recognise from something called the Burgess model, which looks like a target. And it's like a concentric circle model. So right in the middle is the CBD, and then the inner city, suburbs, rural urban fringe as you go out. It's a bit of an outdated model, and really, in many cases not accurate. But it does fit Norwich quite nicely, which is useful for us. And you need to be aware of these different regions. Okay, the exam would specifically identify these regions, and you need to also be aware of how that each region varies in terms of its characteristics. So the characteristics you need to be aware of are how old the housing is and what it looks like. So I've got a summary for all of that for you there. How closely packed the buildings are together, so the density of the buildings, and again, summary. The types of land use or functions that you would find there. So retail, admin, whatever might be there, residential. Again, summary there. And what the environmental quality would be like in those areas. So the noise pollution, air pollution, visual pollution, how much green space there is. So again, I've summarised that for you there. Okay, so you've got a good summary that's specific to Norwich, but also generically shows you how these different features and characteristics change at different parts of the city as you get from the inside of the city further outwards. Okay, so make sure you've got a fairly comprehensive set of notes on this, please. All right, now the other thing this topic is known for is key terms. And there's one particular session you would have done in lessons that focused on 4 key terms which sound very similar because they all contain the word urbanisation in them. The first one is urbanisation in general, and we've already got a definition of that. We did that in the very first part of the content of this video. So urbanisation is the increase in proportion of people living in towns and cities. And this diagram sort of represents that. So before places urbanised, most places are rural, and the green represents rural. And people, the black arrows, move towards places, settlements, which cause those places to grow. And that is essentially urbanisation in a nutshell. So this is the definition of urbanisation. And for Norwich, that happened in the 18th and 19th centuries. So what I've got for you on this screen now is a definition with a diagram that might help you understand it. I'm not sure, it might not, but it might do. And then an example of what that looked like in Norwich. So I've got 18th, 19th centuries in Norwich, and that was specifically people moving into the city to get jobs in the textile industry and shoe industry. So 41% of all jobs in Norwich were actually in manufacturing, textiles and shoes. And that was responsible for the first wave really of urbanisation to Norwich. It always existed, but it really grew and boomed in terms of its population with fewer people needing jobs in agriculture and more jobs being available in the city for manufacturing. Okay, now this is going to disappear as I go on to the next bit. So this is urbanisation. The next diagram represents suburbanisation. So the growth of the suburbs happened as more and more people moved into those areas. They needed to spread the city outwards. So the suburbanisation is the outward spread of houses and buildings further from the city, and that's where you develop these things called suburbs. So they're places like Helsden now, Mile Cross, for example. They're all suburban areas. Lakenham, Earlham, they're all parts of Norwich which are the suburbs. And again, I've got examples of how the suburbs started to develop in Norwich specifically, with the name of a few of them, Mile Cross and Lakenham as they are today, and when that occurred. So again, you need to make sure your notes cover all this for Norwich. So you've just got an understanding, really. I very much doubt this specific information is going to be useful in an exam question. Okay, don't quote me on that, but I strongly doubt you'll need to talk about Mile Cross and Lakenham. If you need to make a nod to them, great, fine, but hopefully you can visualise Mile Cross at least, because that's our kind of side of the city from Reefham, and you'll be able to visualise what we mean by the suburbs. So urbanisation, suburbanisation. Then you get something called counter-urbanisation. As the city becomes bigger and sprawls a bit more, people, for some reasons, but also industry and jobs, will move away from the city centre, and that's called counter-urbanisation. So that's the movement of people and employment from major cities to maybe smaller towns or other settlements beyond the city limits. Okay, and that can be for a number of reasons. Firstly, it could be because you need to move lots of people out to redevelop certain houses that are very old or bomb damaged from a war, or not very good quality, because they're built a long time ago and very cheaply. But also other industries will move out because it's hard to get trucks and lorries and things that you need to get your goods in and out of a congested city. So here's your Norwich example. So you've got urbanisation, suburbanisation, counter-urbanisation, and then a trend which is called re-urbanisation, of people moving back towards the city centre. And this is responsible for the increased urbanisation rate in cities in the UK now. So people are moving back towards city centres because they're being redeveloped, and they largely kind of focus on young professionals, people looking for work, people moving to fashionable areas, and old areas like were brownfield sites like Riverside, that you've only ever known it as a quite plush flats and entertainment facilities around near Carrow Road. But Parts of Chapelfield were really run down, and again, they've built housing and built a shopping centre to attract people back to the city for both industry and housing. Okay, so urbanisation, suburbanisation, counter-urbanisation, and re-urbanisation. And really, Mexico City is only going through mostly stages 1 and 2, whereas Norwich is kind of experiencing re-urbanisation. Okay, so, and again, I've got some photos to give you examples. This is the Riverside area. You can see, this is only 95. I know you weren't born then, but I was, the ripe old age of 9 years old in 1995, and it's not since, long since that was actually a really run-down area, and they've improved this with like the car park and the housing and the facilities like the cinema and stuff like that. And they've even improved Norwich City FC with the Gerald stand. But the biggest difference is the buildings either side of, right next to the river, hence why it's called Riverside. There are high-rise blocks of flats now that cover this entire area that my arrow is going over. And this is what you can see now at Riverside. It's much more desirable. And the housing has been improved as well. This isn't actually in Norwich, but one example of how you can redevelop housing. You keep the character, but you make it plush. Right, so now moving on to migration. And migration in general is the movement of people from one place to another. And we can categorise migration, but the key is migration is just movement of people from one place to another. It doesn't have to be a country. So international migration can happen into Norwich from people arriving from other countries, but it can also happen from people from Norwich moving out to other countries to go abroad. But it's both from a country to a country, so it's international. National migration can also occur, so people can move to Norwich from other parts of the UK, but they can also leave Norwich to go to other parts of the UK, and that's classed as national migration. It's all migration, people are moving, but international is they're moving either to or from a different country, and national is they're moving to or from a different part of the United Kingdom. So make sure you know the difference between those, please. Now, Norwich specifically has got a mix of international and national migration, just like Mexico City, and I'm going to talk you through some of the specifics. So here you've got a table of statistics that last from 2002 to 2013, so it's sort of a 10, 11-year period of migration into Norwich from people from other countries. And you can see the different nationalities we've got: Polish, Lithuanian, Portuguese, Latvian, Indian, Hungarian, Bulgarian, Chinese, Romanian, and Slovakian. Now, lots of these have a lot of things in common, and some of them, there have been varying reasons as to why people from these countries specifically have moved to Norwich in different numbers. So let's summarise where the people are coming from. Firstly, large numbers from Eastern Europe. A lot of these countries, Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, Hungary, Bulgaria, Romania, Slovakia, are all classed as kind of Eastern Europe. They're certainly east of the UK, which is probably the furthest west in Europe you can get. So Eastern Europeans largely have moved to Norwich, and the reason why? Because there's job opportunities. As the UK was part of the EU, no longer is, but was part of the EU, its membership meant that there was freedom of movement to work. And now that attracted people from Eastern European countries because they could do the same job that they did and they're skilled at doing in their country, but for much higher wages. So it attracted them to the UK and to Norwich, and Norwich benefited because it benefited from these workers where we had a shortage of skilled workers in those areas. So lots of people come from European nations for better economic opportunities. That's the where from and why. We had some, and quite a large number actually, from India, over 1,000, nearly 2,000 in fact, from India within that area. And why people from India might come to Norwich is firstly economic opportunities as well, but also we've got a very strong link to India in terms of the Commonwealth as a nation, and we explore that more in the development topic as well. And you might also notice a large number of people from China, again over 1,000 people in that period of time, and that's probably because of education opportunities. So international study, learning a new language, but the UEA is a very reputable centre for education. It's got a lot of specialisms which attract a large number of people globally. It's got a medical university, so it's a place where you can study and learn to be a doctor. But it's also world renowned for its climate studies, and it's also got strong links to other kind of biological studies through the John Innes Centre, which is a bioscience, crop science kind of global powerhouse. So there we go. We've got where people come from to go to Norwich and the reasons why, the varying reasons why. And you need to be aware of these reasons why people move to Norwich specifically. Now this graph shows you specifically the UEA and how important the UEA is with regards to migration into Norwich. So the UEA attracts people internationally and nationally, and you can see a summary on the right hand side. So most of the people, 3/4 of the people that come to the UEA are from the UK, and a large number of those, 44%, come from the east. So they come from local areas. And then the second and third most UK-based migrants to Norwich, so these two areas, are the southeast and London. So all of these areas, which make up about 68% of Norwich's population, of migration population, UEA students population. Sorry, I'll get my words out soon. Are close by to Norwich. They're near to East Anglia if they're not in East Anglia. So the reason why, firstly, the UA's got a great reputation for medicine and environmental sciences, I've mentioned. One of the best in the country for environmental sciences, and actually globally speaking. But also, it's close by to these places in the region, so proximity is a big factor too. It also gets, though, 1 in 4 students come from outside the UK. That's a huge number. Nearly 4,000 students in the UEA, particularly in this year, came from outside of the UK. And again, it's the interest in education opportunities, but also international study, which lead to those people wanting to go to the UEA. So international students arriving to the UK from China, India, from other parts of the world, are attracted to its reputation and the opportunities it provides. One type of migration that we kind of don't actually mention with regards to Norwich, because Norwich hasn't seen a huge number of people arriving from places like Syria, but it's worthwhile me noting it, is because of conflict, asylum seekers. So often migration can be associated with, international migration can be associated with people fleeing conflict or natural disasters in their countries of origin. So it's just worth noting that that's something which can be a reason for people migrating internationally, which Norwich doesn't really demonstrate, so I wanted to mention it anyway. So this is another graph that shows you migration into Norwich from the darker green, but it also tells you about migration out of Norwich with the lighter green. So we're going to focus on where people are going to Norwich from, mostly Southend actually. You can see the biggest number of people in this 6-year period that migrated to Norwich came from Southend in Essex. Sorry about the terrible accent. And that's probably because of maybe early retirement, people selling up a property worth quite a lot of money on the fringes of London to go and buy a small country mansion in the suburbs of Norwich, to try and just dial back their pace of life a little bit. But you can see actually there's a huge spread of people coming into Norwich from other places. And again, looking at the dark green arrows, you've got Portsmouth, Bournemouth, Plymouth, Newport, Gloucester, Northampton, Telford, all of these places, and these black dots represent a significant enough proportion of people, between 1 and 100 arriving to Norwich, and there's a massive spread. Now, a lot of that might be migrants moving to work. Okay, so it doesn't have to be international migrants. These can be people from other parts of the country moving to Norwich for work. Because Norwich is quite a big financial centre. Aviva employs lots of people, but also Aviva's got branches around the country. So maybe transferring of people from one part of the country to another, to go and live in the beautiful city that is Norwich. Why wouldn't you want to live in Norwich? So in terms of people moving from Norwich, the light green arrows, mostly you can't really pinpoint it on a couple of places. You've got Bristol and Sheffield and Leeds, but largely, people sort of spreading towards Yorkshire, northern areas, and down to the southwest. And again, probably because of either moving away for university or moving for work. But it might well be people moving out of Norwich that attended Norwich for university that are moving back to where they're from, or seeking jobs in other bigger cities. Okay, so again, a good summary of migration to and from Norwich from the UK in terms of national migration. And this really is just another graphic that shows a few things linking to the UEA as well. We talked about students moving away, and this bar chart is probably the best at showing this. So you can see the biggest bar, people moving into Norwich, is from the age ranges of 16 to 21. And then you've got some early retirees maybe coming to Norwich, a small number, 46 to 64. Every other age category is actually people leaving Norwich more than arriving. So we get most of our people migrating away from Norwich nationally in the ages of 22 to 25. That absolutely follows on from people finishing their degree and going elsewhere to find work or move back home. You can see again a lot of these working age groups of people leaving, and then a small proportion of people that are over 65 also leave Norwich, probably to go and retire near the coast somewhere or abroad. So most migrants that we get to Norwich are between 16 and 21, with a small increase in the 46 to 64 year olds, like I mentioned. So these would be students coming to the UEA and the Norwich University of the Arts, and maybe early retirees. And people moving from Norwich, all other age ranges do to a certain degree, but largely this is 22 to 25 year category, and that's to move back to maybe where they're from or to find work elsewhere away from Norwich from their degree courses. Okay, again, another summary of this migration. So you've got really detailed information about migration to and from Norwich that you can utilise. Now, impacts of migration on Norwich can be summarised in this mind map, and in lessons I use this mind map to actually apply it to an evaluate 8-mark question. Because the impacts can be positive and negative. These impacts really don't necessarily, some of them hint towards one or the other, but you've got to try and consider these impacts on Norwich of migration, specifically migration, and maybe prepare yourself for an 8-mark question on it. Because if it says evaluate the impacts of migration on Norwich, you've got to take the impacts and identify a positive and a negative with it. So Norwich's population is younger because of those students, and therefore we have a young available workforce, keen workforce. We can develop kind of, and they're educated because they're moving to students, so that's a positive. You've got a young, educated, hungry workforce really. Whereas a negative of that is that maybe some of the services are going to be geared towards just a younger population, and therefore moves money away from the elderly population. So there you go. Try and think of a positive and negative for each of these different impacts. Or if you were in my lessons and you did an 8-mark question, just read that and review that, because a couple of these in an 8-mark answer would be really useful, and knowing positives and negatives for each is useful. So get these notes down if you don't already. You should have, but again, just have a little read through them before you move on, please. So now we've looked at the impacts of migration on Norwich, we can start to look at de-industrialization, and this is specifically a topic you cover for Norwich. You won't look at this for Mexico City because it's not de-industrializing. So we break up the causes of de-industrialization into 4 main categories. Okay, globalization, decentralization, technological advances, and transport developments. For each of these, there's a definition in green and a Norwich-based example in yellow. I don't need to tell you much more about this other than for you to be aware that de-industrialization does come up. It quite regularly comes up. It's not often, again, very specific, but it could definitely be. Okay, this could easily lend itself to a 4-mark question. And if the 8-mark question is about Mexico City, then a 4-mark question is probably going to be about Norwich. And de-industrialization is one that really would lend itself to specific detail. So I'd like you to just spend time looking at what these things mean, globalization, decentralization, etc., and how Norwich has kind of got an example to illustrate that thing. The key thing is, though, all of these 4 factors result in de-industrialization. Okay, the removal or the closing of industry in Norwich, the change in the economic kind of structure of Norwich, fewer jobs in manufacturing, basically, which means that Norwich has to adapt. Okay, so as a result of de-industrialization predominantly, that's kind of one of the reasons that inequality exists in cities like Norwich, because it leads to a difference in economic structure. And in a moment, I'm going to try and encourage you to link these things together. But these got 5 things that are pinpointed by the exam board with regards to things that create inequality in cities like Norwich. So you need to know these things just basically, but you also need to know how these things can create inequality. So poor quality housing creates inequality in Norwich, but how? Think about it. So for example, if your housing is leaky or not very efficient, it could cost you more money, which means you've got less money to spend on things like recreation. Whereas if you live in a nice modern energy efficient house which isn't leaking or it doesn't cost a fortune to heat, you'll have more money for those things. Okay, so quality of housing affects the health of people and their ability to access maybe things like recreation, which create happier people. High unemployment, that's an obvious one, but how does that create inequality? Areas of high unemployment, what's that going to affect? How's that going to affect people? Think about it, please, and try and, if you're going to use this in your notes, if you haven't already done it, try and add to each of these as to how it creates inequality, and be as detailed as possible. Because in any case where you have to try and explain, all you're doing is preparing yourself for an explain question. You get an explain question. Explain how inequality can be created in a city in the developing world. You'd get a mark for saying schools can be overstretched in certain parts, but you'll then get a second mark for explaining why overstretched schools create inequality. Less resources for every pupil, therefore it could affect exam results, which mean the education standards go down, which cause wealthy people to move out of the area, causing it to get less money. Or lower standard of education means their students in these schools are less likely to get well-paid jobs in future and have more disposable income. Okay, so you can link it in a number of ways, but you need to be considering that to make you sort of exam ready. Okay. Now, as part of looking at inequality in Norwich, we compare 2 wards, and I've picked the wards for you for Norwich. And again, this is just to give you some illustration of just how unequal Norwich can be. And I've put into categories the different types of kind of inequality we could see. So educational inequality, you can see from the percentage of people in Eton that have no qualifications versus the percentage of people in Mancroft that have no qualifications. So 16% versus 24%. That is a huge jump. 1 in 4 people in Mancroft have no qualifications whatsoever. Unemployment, again, 2 unemployment stats to compare. Percentage unemployed, Eton ward, and that will include people that don't need to work. 6.8% unemployed in Mancroft. The number of people claiming benefits also illustrates this. So of the 2.7% unemployed in Eton ward in 2020, only 1.4% of those people were claiming benefits. So essentially half the number of unemployed people claimed benefits, whereas nearly all the unemployed people in Mancroft claimed benefits, which tells you that these were people unemployed because they wanted to work but couldn't. These show you that half the people unemployed didn't need to work. Okay, so they might be retired or have lots of private wealth. Housing differences. Number of rooms in an Eton ward house, 6.4 versus 4.1. Smaller houses, more cramped conditions maybe. Amount of social housing, so council houses, 387 versus 1,808. Again, that makes a link to income and potential struggles with getting on the housing ladder, affordable housing. Crime rates, 57 crimes per 1,000 people, 396 crimes per 1,000 people. So 8 times more crime, roughly, in Mancroft. Other crime stats, 10.4 per 1,000 of the crimes were antisocial behaviour, whereas 123 per 1,000 were antisocial behaviour in Mancroft. That suggests that, and this is one I'll explain for you, antisocial behaviour is linked to basically bored teenagers a lot of the time, or people getting a bit drunk and shouting a bit. Now, this suggests that there is maybe more to do for young people that doesn't involve getting drunk at the local park, whereas this one suggests there's less for them to do, and so therefore they're suffering with inequality with regards to recreation, and there's more access to things like pubs and alcohol. Deprivation, and we're going to look at this in a second. 66.7% live in the least deprived decile, okay, 10% or 10 categories. You've got the most deprived, which is category 1, and the least deprived is category 10. So 2/3 of the people that live in Eton are in the least deprived category, whereas half the people that live in Mancroft are in the most deprived category. You could not find it more polarised. And then health data, 82% of people good or very good health, whereas 73% are in good or very good health. So it's clearly affecting their health as well. And life expectancy reflects that. Male life expectancy is more than 82 in Eton, where it's less than 77 in Mancroft. So there's over a 5-year gap between the two. So there you go, look, a really comprehensive summary of just how unequal the city of Norwich is depending on where you're looking. Now a map illustrates that nicely, and you can actually see Norwich has got a lot of orange and red. There's lots of deprivation in the city of Norwich, which a lot of people don't know. If you just go to the city centre, you see nice buildings like the Forum and historic buildings like the church and the churches, the cathedral, the castle. But what you don't realise is that actually the people that live in Norwich are in hugely deprived areas, and Mancroft is one, Mile Cross is another, Bowthorpe, where you've got Cossey, is another, Lakenham, but Eton stands out really as a wealthy part of Norwich, and this is where you're going to find places like fairly close to Cringleford as well, down in the sort of more central regions. So around the university is far more wealthy and far less deprived. So what I want to impress upon you is questions in the exam board that talk about economic change. What they mean by this term is basically de-industrialization. Norwich has changed economically through de-industrialization. Now that has led to deprivation, which you've seen in the map, which creates inequality and affects people's quality of life. And you've seen how all of these things, these terms, work together as a result of de-industrialization or economic change. Okay, that's an important concept just to link those two, or those factors together. Now, Norwich and de-industrialisation is one thing that they've encountered for a number of years, and there's been 4 waves of de-industrialisation over the years, and all of those waves have occurred for different reasons. One of the reasons was people moved away because the city kind of urbanised, and so suburbs developed. And as people moved away to go into the suburbs, the city centre still had businesses that needed to attract those people, which might not have cars and good transport networks. So the challenge for Norwich has always been, when people move away from the city centre physically, how can you encourage them to come back to use the businesses and shops that are there? So suburbanization led to the first wave of decline to the CBD, and there's been 3 other waves since. De-industrialization was another one. As jobs decreased, people moved away from those city centre areas, the inner city factories. The growth of the internet and internet shopping has moved people away from the city centre and moved them online. And that's been made worse by the coronavirus pandemic, because people aren't able to go to these areas. So Norwich has seen a huge decline. It's certainly got challenges to come. And the out-of-town retail parks as well, like Longwater, that have developed, are another one of those decentralising and deindustrialising factors. So 4 waves of decentralisation in Norwich that have led to it needing to adapt. So I've got loads of strategies here, and you've also got some from your lessons, which all illustrate how the CBD has fought back. So you've got Chapel Field, which was an old, horrible closed down chocolate factory, turned into a good shopping centre that looks nice next to a lovely park, and there's housing there as well. Castle Mall, which was built but is also now being redeveloped and refurbished and turned into Castle Quarter. Anglia Square, there's plans to redevelop it. It's been going for a while, but it will happen at some point. And Anglia Square now is a bit of a joke amongst people, especially your age of Norwich. You don't go to Anglia Square unless you want to go to Poundland. But it's a thriving hub of cultural kind of mixing there, and it's a great place. I used to live right near Anglia Square, and yes, the shopping centre is pretty rubbish, but if they redevelop it, wow, imagine it, how good it could be. The market became permanent. So it got rid of the rubbish canvas roofs that looked all mouldy, and they're now solid roofs. Park and ride schemes we mentioned, art trails, Norfolk Norwich Festival, Run Norwich 10k event which happens every year, that attracts tens of thousands of people to Norwich. independent stores like the Elm Hill kind of shopping culture, where you've got the cobbled streets and the independent, one-off shops that you only get in Norwich. And Norwich is pedestrianising areas even more. So St Stephen's isn't fully pedestrianised, but they've made it safer for people because only buses and taxis can go down there now. And around near John Lewis, they've also pedestrianised that whole area. So the CBD fighting back again, you need to know specific ways that Norwich has fought back to retain people and encourage people back to the CBD. Now, in the last part of the Norwich-based section of this PowerPoint, I'll give you a bit more exam practice, and I'm going to show you on one screen, which I don't do, how assess and evaluate structures compare with certain questions. So this is really two questions where you can see how you'd answer one versus the other. So the first question is assess how a named UK city is becoming more sustainable, or you could get evaluate how a named UK city is becoming more sustainable. Now, both of these really have the same topic at hand, sustainability, and Norwich is a place with lots of strategies to try and retain sustainability. But I'm going to show you how you'd structure an essay differently for an assess or evaluate. So in my advice below, assess stuff, or stuff that applies to both, is in non-bold, whereas evaluate stuff is in bold, so how it differs. So firstly, for both, you need to name the UK city you're using. Doesn't matter whether you're doing assess or evaluate, name the UK city. So Norwich. Okay? And then you name something that Norwich is doing to become more sustainable. Norwich has 6 park and ride sites. Okay? Now, again, the same for both is the starting point. You describe what it involves. Also the same. First points 1, 2 and 3 are exactly the same for assess or evaluate questions, which is handy for you. Then it starts to change slightly. So you then, if it's an assess question, you develop your answer by saying how or why that thing that Norwich is doing is making it more sustainable. How do 6 park and ride sites make Norwich more sustainable? Or, if you're evaluating it, you tell me one positive of how park and ride makes Norwich more sustainable. What is a good thing about park and ride? And then you need to give a stat. Now for both, you need a stat. At this point, once you've done the stat, you've done your assess. Okay, 1 to 5, ignoring the bold bit, is your assess paragraph structure. For evaluate, you've got to go a little bit further, because to evaluate you need to give a negative. So you still have a stat for the positive, but you then give a negative and another stat. So this is where evaluate and assess differ. It's not by much. You can see basically the same. But for evaluate, you just need that extra little bit, and you focus on a positive for 4 and a negative for this extra bit. Okay, and that's just how the two change, and until you get to the conclusion. So the conclusion obviously follows you doing at least 2 paragraphs for steps 1 to 5 or 1 to 6 for another thing that Norwich is doing to become more sustainable. But your conclusion will vary. So if you're doing an assess question, your conclusion says which is the most significant of the 2 that you've looked at. For your evaluate, you're telling me overall, has Norwich been successful or not? Is Norwich's ability, are the positives of Norwich's sustainable measures good or bad overall? Okay, and again, that's the difference between the two. Hopefully my verbal explanation and this will kind of help you when it comes to knowing the difference between assess or evaluate, because students often confuse how to structure the two, and although they're very similar, there are these ever so slight differences that you need to be aware of when it comes to you answering a question. Okay, now here are the stats, okay, that you've got loads of, and again you should have these in your notes, and if you've not, I'll leave that on there. But we are about to move on to Mexico City. It's going to take us less time to cover Mexico City, and the PowerPoint itself is already up at over an hour, so we're going to try and whiz through. Okay, for Mexico City, you need to know its site, its situation, connectivity, and culture. Okay, so rather than function, culture is a factor that comes into this. Now, this is taken shamelessly from the exam board's revision guide, so I'm going to quote them on this. This is not my work, and you can also see Mexico City's growth with this map here. You can see how Mexico City began in 1700 with this red section, and just now the grey is how the kind of sprawling areas have combined to be really a major part of Mexico City. So it's a huge sprawling mass which has grown quite significantly over time outwardly. Okay, now I'm going to just leave these screens for you to pause at your own leisure to get the notes or to make sure your notes are there. Structurally speaking, Mexico City again has the CBD, the inner city, the suburbs and the rural urban fringe, just like Norwich, but the characteristics are slightly different. Okay, in the rural urban fringe, Norwich is kind of very rural. It's got airports and a couple of roads, but it's mostly countryside. Whereas in Mexico City, it's dominated by your shanty towns. Okay, by the shanty towns that grow there, and that's because of this rapid rural to urban migration that's taken place. So again, I'm going to leave this on the screen for you to pause and make notes at your own leisure. Now, the growth of Mexico City and population growth of Mexico City is absolutely stark, and certainly since the 1950s has been huge. By 2010, it had grown from just under 3 million people to just under 20 million people over the space of 60 years. That is a huge amount of growth. And again, you can see some stats about the population growth underneath the graph. You need to be aware of the causes of that growth, which we've summarised generally right at the start of this video session, but also you need some specifics from this as well. Okay, so sorry, I'll just go back, and again, if you want to pause the screen just to check your notes have got this information, because remember in lessons you would have done this as a big kind of project over 3 or 4 lessons, just to check your notes, make sure you've got a good summary of the population growth in Mexico City, both what it looks like but also why it's happened. Okay, and when you're ready, move on. So national and international migration, again, mirroring what we've covered for Norwich, but looking at the Mexico-based example. This tells you where people in Mexico are moving from, and it's mostly national. Okay, rural to urban migration is the huge factor there because of that number of people looking for better work, better housing, access to water, healthcare, etc. Migrants do arrive internationally, but you get some from places like the USA, which is close by, and actually Germany and France have also got industries and companies, TNCs, that have invested in Mexico City and have provided opportunities for people from those countries to move and work and live in Mexico City too. But they focus themselves in the wealthier parts of the city. Now, impacts of migration on Mexico City, and just like Norwich, you may well need to develop these impacts to explain them and identify maybe positives and negatives of migration. You can see the greater need for homes and the impact and the formation of these shanty towns. Space is a big issue in Mexico City, and there's very little open space, but they need to create more. Which is being kind of snapped up by the growing population. But there's also huge inequality. Massive poverty occurs in Mexico City too. And many migrants are moving for jobs and things, and that's reducing the average age. That's very similar to Norwich, actually. The average age of people in Mexico City is going down because of that attracting younger people looking for work. But that also links to things like crime rates when those people don't necessarily get the work they're looking for. Air, noise, pollution, huge issues as a result of the rise in car ownership, and things like crime. Fear of crime is a big thing. There's a big difference between Norwich and Mexico City. If you just Google homicides map in Mexico City or murder map Mexico City, you'll be amazed to see just how many there are versus Norwich itself. And again, the difficulties, and I showed you some video in lessons of supplying clean water, and if you want to look back at the lessons from the specific lesson folder about the difficulty in supplying clean and safe water for the poorest parts of Mexico City relative to the less poor parts, because Mexico City has real issues being built on a dry riverbed. They've actually moved a lot of the moisture away from the city, which evaporates because it's in this big bowl surrounded by mountains. Okay, now that graph, just shows you a bit of a comparison between cities and countries, but don't worry about that for now. Okay, so once you've got all the notes for this section, please feel free to move on. Impacts of rapid urbanization, and this is a homicides map that I was showing you, not a great picture for Mexico City. Housing shortages, again, something which is more focused on places rapidly urbanizing, which is not happening in Norwich. So all this rapid urbanization, all these impacts, you only associate with Mexico City. So development of squatter settlements, underemployment, pollution, and not enough services for things like waste disposal. Again, I will leave those on the screen for you to look at and to make sure you've got in your notes adequately. But remember, this is focusing specifically on Mexico City because Norwich isn't undergoing rapid urbanisation, so it doesn't have the same issues that are associated with rapid urbanisation. Inequality in Mexico City. Again, I don't need to describe to you what inequality is. The shanty towns are far more extremely disadvantaged and deprived than the wealthy kind of areas of Mexico City where the people on higher incomes are. And again, you can see a comparison in both wages, education and services on the screen, which summarises those three key inequality factors which I want you to think about for Mexico City. So again, I don't need to do anything other than really just show you this, and you take your time to pause the screen, read it through, and if you want to add some stats to your notes that you don't have, feel free to do that, please. Okay, we are coming to the very end of this PowerPoint now. So hopefully, I know I've rushed through the Mexico City stuff, but being a video that you can pause and look at, if there's anything you're not sure about, you don't understand with regards to Mexico City, email me or come and ask me when you next see me or your teacher, and they'll more than happily talk you through it. It's not a problem. So ways in which Mexico City are trying to overcome these issues with inequality and stuff are through top-down projects and bottom-up projects. Things that you've identified in the topic of development, actually looking at India. But when we looked at top-down projects, we actually looked at China's Three Gorges Dam, and bottom-up projects we looked at Tanzania's water aid projects, and that was, remember, for the topic of development. Now, in changing cities, there's crossover. The same principles and definitions apply to what are top-down development projects and what are bottom-up projects. But in Mexico City, you need to know specific ones for Mexico City and why they're trying to, or what they're trying to do. So these projects are really designed to link into these problems: this extreme wealth versus poverty, okay, and this impact of rapid urbanization. So these issues associated with Mexico City are what they're trying to address through their top-down and bottom-up projects. So bottom-up projects involve things like community-based projects, and there are three examples of Mexico City community-based projects. I would certainly urge you to know at least two of these. And you can see that they involve, the Cultiva Ciudad. Remember that, okay, because that will show specific information in an exam. Are trying to educate children about managing gardens so that they can grow food. That links nicely to the rooftop gardens, which have been encouraged to grow food for people, utilising the space on top of roofs rather than the lack of green space elsewhere. And local groups get together to raise money for schools and healthcare centres, and that's just to try and give people in the less developed parts, the more deprived parts of Mexico City, the suburbs and the shanty towns, access to education and healthcare, so they can really overcome the problems of lack of health and education standards. So they are bottom-up projects. Top-down projects include things like sustainable transport schemes, and Mexico City came up with a bus rapid transport scheme, but they've also reduced pollution, air pollution, which is one of those major issues with rapid development or rapid growth, because of their metro bus system. And transport journeys, meaning people can get from the outskirts into the city far faster than they used to be able to, meaning that they're not at a loss with regards to job opportunities maybe closer to the CBD. So there you go, you've got your bottom-up and top-down projects. And another project, which is a combination of the two, but largely as a top-down scheme, is the waste recycling. And this will help deal with that other issue which we've established of additional waste pollution to Mexico City. So you can see about its recycling scheme, and it illustrates the issue with landfill, but the trading system, trash for food, is the scheme. If you put trash for food in your exam, then that would be really good, put it in inverted commas, because it's the name of the trading system. People bring their rubbish to the right place, and they get like food vouchers and sometimes even things like bus ticket vouchers and stuff like that to help them. So you've got your bottom up development projects and the community based ones I showed you. Sustainable transport schemes and waste recycling are both top down projects, and these are all things that Mexico City are trying to do to reduce those problems associated with rapid growth. Okay, now that is the very last part of this video, and I'm going to stop short really quickly because otherwise it won't upload to YouTube. Thank you for listening. Again, it's a very comprehensive summary. If you need detail about any more of these sessions, please feel free to go into the Changing Cities playlist, which has got every single lesson by lesson resources and explanation with much more depth than this revision summary can give you. Hopefully the exam skills have helped you as well as alongside, but like I said, any questions you've got, please come and see me or one of your geography teachers, and we'll be able to explain anything a bit further. Thank you very much for listening and bearing with it, and I will see you next time for another session.